So without further ado, I'll hand it off to Dr. Samy Suissa, CNODES Executive, who will kick off our spring virtual semi-annual meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne. So it is now 10 years since CNODES was created, and we thought that this meeting should be a great opportunity to look at what we've done and what we are planning to do in the next future. My name is Samy Suissa. I'm the co-lead of CNODES and have been for the last 10 years. So why CNODES? Well, if we look at this paper, do calcium channel blockers increase the risk of cancer, published in 1996. This was based on an observational study from a database that suggested that the patients who were using CCBs for the treatment of hypertension and other cardiovascular conditions had a twofold increase in the incidence of cancer. This caused, of course, a lot of concern among patients who were using these drugs, and these drugs were used extensively. Yet in studies that were conducted in the subsequent 2 years using computerized databases, this initial observation was not confirmed. In fact, all of the studies showed no increased risk of cancer with calcium channel blockers. Another example is the example of Vioxx, COX-2 inhibitors. When the very first randomized trial was conducted, a signal of an increased cardiovascular risk with one particular one, rofecoxib, compared to naproxen, was identified. What was the Canadian response there? Well, several observational studies in Canada looked at this question. The very first one was conducted in Ontario, published in 2003, which found no increased risk with Vioxx and other COX-2 inhibitors, with no increased cardiovascular risk with these COX-2 inhibitors. In Quebec, however, 2 years later, a study actually found a small increase in risk. And in Saskatchewan in 2009, another small increase in risk, but not statistically significant. And the raison d'etre of CNODES is basically why do these studies have to be distributed over time? Why can't they all be done at the same time? Why in 2003 and why not in 2001? And why not include British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, and Atlantic provinces? Why should not all provinces of Canada be working together on this question at an earlier point in time when the signal was initially presented? So this is in fact where CNODES was formed and created. It was created by an act of government, and it was funded by CIHR and the Drug Safety and Effectiveness Network, DSEN. Originally, I have to pay a very small tribute to Bob Peterson, who was the founding director of DSEN and who helped us put together this Canada-wide initiative. So what is CNODES? It's a trans-Canadian collaboration of over 100 pharmacoepidemiologists, pharmacists, biostatisticians, physicians, clinicians, data analysts, research assistants, and students. It was funded initially in 2011 and renewed 5 years later in 2016. It's a distributed network, 7 provincial data centers in Canada, access to 2 international databases, one from the US and one from the UK. And in total, this is big data. This is access to administrative health data of over 100 million insured people across these data sets. The structure is shown here. Now, I'm not going to talk much about the structure, but what I would like to highlight especially are the 4 special teams that CNODES created. One is the methods team that works on the development of new methods or improving existing methods. The database team, which works on the development of tools to facilitate access to data and to facilitate data in general, data usage in general. So for example, registries of data or different dictionaries of data sets. The training team is crucial to not only to train our current generation, but to train the next generation of analysts of data of data sets in pharmacoepidemiology and drug safety. And finally, our KT team, which helps us to pass on this knowledge to the main population and stakeholders. This is what we looked at almost 10 years ago, our very first meeting in Montreal, or sorry, this was, I believe, the first meeting in Halifax. And some of the people here are still with us. Others, such as David Henry, is now has moved to Australia. Gary Tier left the Saskatchewan Center, and unfortunately, Pat Martins left us, passed away a few years ago. So what does CNODES do? CNODES looks at a common protocol applied to data sets across the various provinces in Canada, and obtains a common estimate across all of these data to increase the power and the precision. And this is in essence our CNODES estimate of data, of effects measured across the country. So some examples of studies that have been conducted, key studies that have been conducted. One is statins and diabetes, which was the object of a labeling update from Health Canada back in 2013. And we conducted a study to confirm this, this effect using the many databases that we have across Canada. And we found that using data from all of the various provinces, as well as the US and the UK data, we found a small increased risk of diabetes with the higher dose statins compared to lower dose statins. Another example is, this is an interesting one because this came about from US House and Senate members who were calling for Canada to move quickly on the availability of opioids that are manufactured north of the border. So basically there was a crisis here that in the US about the misuse of opioids and the belief that they were coming from our country, from Canada. Citing a study recently published in the CMAJ, Upton, who is a Health Canada person, wrote in an email statement that there is no evidence of any increase in dispensing of the generic non-tamper resistant formulations near the Canada-US border. And this was based on a study that CNODES had conducted and published very rapidly looking at this question. Another Health Canada issue was incretin-based therapies for type 2 diabetes and the risk of pancreatic cancer. And the response was that Health Canada has initiated an epidemiological study through DSEN, the Drug Safety and Effectiveness Network, to assess the potential association between pancreatic cancer and incretin-based therapies. And this study was conducted by CNODES, and that study was published, the report was given to Health Canada, and the study was published in the BMJ looking at the risk of pancreatic cancer with these drugs, as well as the risk of acute pancreatitis. And again, working in concert with DSEN and Health Canada on this issue. The study received a wide exposure by being cited in many different places, including New England Journal of Medicine, Journal Watch. While we were conducting this study, this is the great thing about having the data right there in place, there was a question of a signal perhaps that these drugs were causing heart failure. And this study was conducted with the same databases, simply looking at whether the risk of heart failure was increased with these drugs. And the study was published a few years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine. It involved 1.5 million patients with diabetes, and 30,000 patients were hospitalized for heart failure, which is, I think, the point that attracted this the journal to publish this. Big numbers, big data, large numbers of patients, very accurate information. And we found that, in fact, there was no increased risk of heart failure, that the signal could not be confirmed with these large databases. A recent one, and this is, I want to share this one because this query here came from a province. It came from the province of Quebec, the INES in Quebec, which is in charge of looking at the various aspects of healthcare and research into healthcare. And they were asking the question of whether SGLT2 inhibitors for type 2 diabetes, again, had a safe and effective profile. So we conducted many studies. This went through DSEN, and we conducted several studies of this question on the risk of ketoacidosis, urosepsis, amputation, and also benefit with respect to cardiovascular events. And Ines actually produced a very large report based on these studies of this question here. So a great collaboration between provinces and DSEN and the Canadian network CNODES here in addressing these questions that are relevant to one province, but in fact, all provinces benefit from this. The training team I'm very proud of, I have to say. The training team is crucial. First, it has an annual training awards program to facilitate training in other places than within CNODES. It offers several CNODES lectures and workshops. The trainees are placed in various positions throughout the network, and this facilitates movement across Canada for different levels of training. And our newsletters highlights the profiles of several trainees. The analyst training program is probably one of the most important aspects of this training team here. And it is, in fact, a very complex program that, that involves not only the training team, but the methods team as well, the database team as well. All of the teams are working in putting together so that trainees can go through the system here and end up having excellent training in data analysis, which is the motor behind which CNODES works. So very briefly, in conclusion, CNODES is a trans-Canadian collaboration of over 100 Canadian researchers, analysts, trainees. It's a powerful tool. It contains data on over 100 million insured people using data from the UK and US as well to supplement 7 Canadian databases. It responds to queries from Health Canada and other Canadian stakeholders. So CADIT has presented queries to us. INES, as I showed, also presented queries to us, and we're looking for queries to come from other provincial bodies. It values tremendously capacity building. So as you saw, the training team has a very large place in our network. The development of novel methods with the methods team and knowledge translation as well. With the next 5 years, very briefly, we want to look at beyond safety, effectiveness, and drug utilization are targets of some of the queries that we want to spend more time on. We want to develop innovative methods to facilitate and to improve the quality of the science behind the work that we do. To expand the number of stakeholders who submit queries, so to encourage provincial bodies to provide some queries as well and to use us in a way. Expand also the training. We are developing simulated data so that trainees can come and easily learn about all of these methods. We're developing international collaborations on some queries with the FDA or the Sentinel team and the EMA, and you will hear about these international collaborations a bit later on. We want to develop new tools to increase productivity, efficiency, and timeliness, namely the common data model and the CNODES variable library. So on this, I want to thank you, and I want to thank all of the founders of this initiative. So the program is a dense 2-hour program. I may have taken an extra 1 or 2 minutes, but at this point, I would like to introduce the Health Canada and the DSEN update, basically the DSEN and Health Canada update that will be given by Barry Jones of Health Canada. So Barry is a senior policy advisor within the Office of Pharmaceutical Management Strategies at Health Canada. He's a member of the CNODES Executive Working Group, and he studied pharmacy at the University of London, UK. And I'm very happy to have Barry here tell us a bit about the update with respect to DCEN and Health Canada in this new era for the next 5 years.
Thank you, Samy, for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me and the CNODES team. I would just like to say that also thank you for CNODES and the contribution that you've made to the program since its inception. And we're very excited about prospects such as the common data model. I just actually came off an EWG meeting, and Mike Patterson was presenting the CDM model to us all at the executive working groups. So we're very happy to learn more about that. So Samy introduced me, so I don't think that needs any further introduction. I will say that I'm on the executive working group, and talking about the evaluation, as you know, was undertaken in 2019, and there were obviously very specific recommendations to that evaluation. The first one being to look at a possible new model for the program. The second of the recommendations was basically components for that model, such as the governance, knowledge translation, and a strategic planning function, and also expedited or better access to data for the program as well. Now, following the evaluation, we wrote the MRAP, the Management Response Action Plan, and my office, OPMS, was considered the OPI, Office of Primary Interest. So we basically penned that in conjunction with CIHR. So the EWG, the Executive Working Group, the role of the EWG in this work is that we are mandated through the terms of reference to implement the MRAP. So that's basically where we are now. And the EWG, just to give you some idea of the people who are actually working on this, what is the makeup of the EWG? It is the program management, which is CIHR and Health Canada. And the Health Canada component comes both from us, Strategic Policy Branch, and MHPD within HPFB. Sorry about all these acronyms. You're probably familiar with HPFB, Health Products and Food Branch, and MHPD, which is the Marketed Health Products Directorate, because they are basically the people who supply most of the queries through to the DCEN. So that it's those people in the project, in the program management, plus CADITH, plus CIHI, and there's a PT representation. So what we did, the EWG then actually made a sub-working group with the same type of representation from those organizations, and they had the function of then building the new model. So as we talk about the new model, what we did, we developed basically a straw man, the initial draft, and then we sent that draft out for consultations. Now, some of you guys at least were involved in those consultations, which I thought went extremely well. And the people we consulted, we had organization-specific interviews that would have been Health Canada, both Strategic Policy Branch and HPFB, CADITH, CIHI, CIHR, and PHAC. Then we had group sessions with the Pharmaceutical Advisory Committee, which is a PT group with the Secretariat of CADITH, basically looks into sort of formulary listing and issues of that nature. Then there was the DCEN research teams, which I thought was an excellent consultation. And then there were other research teams that were not affiliated with DCEN, and that was a separate session. We also did an online survey. So what we took to those consultations was our broad overview of the model. And I'm just going to go through that very quickly and how we put this together. The first thing we did was develop 6 guiding principles, which now has become 7, by the way, with feedback from the steering committee. But it was basically to be responsive to decision makers, to have an amount of accountability within the program, to be flexible to meet the needs of the decision makers and changing priorities, to be arm's length from commercial and other competing interests, which we know is difficult. Optimizing the evidence, when that would be sort of through fit for purpose KT and identifying secondary and tertiary knowledge users as well. Capacity building, which was a key thing, and also in the evaluation as well, which was linked to recommendation 1 to look for the new model. And lastly, the steering committee suggested that we add coordination and collaboration, meaning that we don't overlook what is already going on and the work of other organizations, that we don't try and rebuild the wheel. We actually work with everything else that's in progress right now. Secondly, after the guiding principles, we looked at specific model elements, and they were based on the, you might remember us talking about this in the consultation, because these were the very questions we asked you, basically, about the options and the model elements. And the model elements were based on the recommendations. So the first one was a funding mechanism to optimize the ROI and responsiveness. And we basically were talking mainly about a grant contract mix. And we looked at the governance and priority setting and features such as a leader in the host organization, a strategic planning and prioritization unit, and the steering, a scientific advisory committee, much as we have right now. Then we looked at the process for managing the queries. That would have been things like strategic planning, long and short-term queries, effectiveness versus safety balance. Much of this will probably be developed more as we go into the implementation phase. Then we wanted knowledge mobilization dissemination, and that was basically focused around integrated KT, developing that more than we have it now, and centralized KT, having a centralized unit, which we thought would prove more effective in the long run. Then the query response mechanism, that was looking at team format, and again, that would be implementation phase more than anything. And finally, capacity development. It was, as we said, we've all agreed that developing the research capacity is important. So basically, after studying all those, we built the model. This is where we are right now. I will say that there's still work to do in terms of, the model is based on those high-level principles, and some of this, there'll be more meat put on those bones as we actually start the implementation phase of that model. So we presented the model to the EWG, the Executive Working Group, in April, and it was basically well received. And then at the end of April, we took it to the steering committee. And the steering committee, once again, basically endorsed all the elements that we put into the model. They had some very, very good input for us, by the way, which we've incorporated now into a revised version of the model. So in terms of next steps, there are a few things to do. We're hoping that most of the work for the prior to the implementation will be finished by the end of May. So the immediate next steps we have is we're looking at host identification process because it was deemed important that we consider, do we have the right host? Now we have the model. So this is the phase of the work we're in. It's ongoing. We're looking at the criteria that would be necessary for the host, and that obviously is linked to all the criteria in the model. Then today, in fact, some of that was presented at the EWG for discussion. And we have a touch base between the ADM and of SPB in Health Canada and the VP, Tammy Clifford of CIHR, coming up shortly to make sure they're comfortable with what is being suggested and recommended to date. And very importantly, we have the second steering committee meeting May 28th. And at that meeting, we will be presenting what the model, once again, the revised model, plus where we have with the host criteria at that point in time. Finally, after that, the working group will make final recommendations for validation endorsement by senior management in the program. That obviously is Health Canada and CIHR. Then that we're hoping will be signed off in early June. Then after that, it'll be implementation and any transition that may be needed. I have to say that the main consideration with all this work and will be going forward is minimal disruption for the program. We want everybody to feel comfortable within the program the way it is right now. And as we make a transition, we're hoping, or whatever transition might be needed to be made, we're hoping that's going to be as smooth as possible. So with that, I will open it to some questions. I do have to leave in not too long, but I'm open to taking some questions, and I know Jennifer's open to taking some questions too.
Barry, this was supposed to be a duo, Jennifer Campbell and Barry Jones. Jennifer Campbell could not make it, but she is here now. And I think she will be taking the questions, but our questions are at the end of the session. So at 4:10, hopefully you can stay on, and I'm sure there will be questions for you. But if not, I'm sure Jennifer can address them between 4:10 and 4:25. We have a discussion session that will be moderated by Ingrid Sketris.
I think I can come back on. Sorry, I initially had 2 meetings back to back alongside this one, but I see one of them has been cancelled. But I have one right now, but I think I can actually come back for the question session.
Perfect. That would be great. So we'll let you into our Zoom meeting. I want to thank you so much because for the ones who don't know what's going on, we had the first 10 years of CNODES, and now we're looking at the next 5 years, and the next 5 years are going to be slightly different. And I think that's what Barry was sharing with us. But clearly, there is a consensus that CNODES is very important, and we will hear a lot of that discussion during the Q&A. Barry, thank you so much for sharing all of this hot stuff with us. And I know you ended with a meeting just a few minutes ago, and you're giving us this information right off the press here. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Samy. And just to endorse what you said, not just CNODES, but review the entire program is very important. And not everybody's viewing the whole DSEM program is very important, and something we think that will be actually more important going into the future, with RWE being what it is, what it will be right now. So we don't see any end to DSEM and the use of DSEM.
Thank you very much, Barry. So we're going to move on to the next speaker, and our next speaker is a member of CNODES. So we wanted to highlight in this meeting 2 activities that I think we have not heard much about, but are crucial to CNODES. One of them is knowledge translation. So we are going to welcome Philippe Mongeau from Dalhousie University, who works with the KT team, and Ingrid Sketris, who will talk to us about CNODES knowledge translation outputs and impact. So Philippe is an assistant professor at the School of Information Management at Dalhousie. He's a director of Quantitative Science Studies Lab and associate member of the Centre Universitaire de Recherche sur la Science et la Technologie at UQAM in Montreal. Philippe, thank you very much, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suissa. Let me just share my screen right now. So you see my slide?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you for having me at this meeting, a very important meeting, 10 years into the network. As Dr. Suissa already mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Dalhousie. My field is bibliometrics and quantitative science studies. So I do not know much about the field that CNODES evolves in, but my team and I are hoping to make a contribution by helping CNODES gather the evidence that it needs to support its impact story, whether it's to funders or to other stakeholders. So that's the essence of my presentation. And before I start, I just want to acknowledge the wonderful team of students that I've been working with: Mohamed Gada, Jesse Hill, Caroline Monroe-Lins, Ingrid, who you know, Sam Stewart, which is another member of CNODES, Ita Swami, which is another student of mine, and Robin, which I think you also know. So, and a lot of people here. So anyway, let me just start with this presentation. So I don't think I need to repeat so much of the background of CNODES. I think Dr. Suissa provided a great introduction in the meeting about what CNODES does. So does queries, publishes papers, and communications for policymakers, other stakeholders. Also, Dr. Suissa mentioned the importance of the trainees that CNODES incorporated their network and position in all that research and activity, which I think is something that is very important to highlight. And our goal in my lab is to help provide bibliometrics and altmetrics support to build these impact narratives around who is CNODES, what does CNODES do, and what impact, what visibility does this work have in science, but also in the media, in policy, and in whatever circle CNODES wishes to be involved. So, yeah. So in order to build such a database of empirical evidence, we're building on several data sources. We start with the publications that have been produced by CNODES. So those were the 92 publications that are hosted in the McGill repository. And then we found these publications in the Microsoft Academic Graph, which is a large-scale database of publications, and the Web of Science. This is for computing the typical bibliometric indicators. But then we also have altmetric.com, which is used for altmetrics indicators. So things like mentions in the news, mentions in policy documents, mentions in social media, Facebook, Reddit, and a lot of different sources. I will talk a little bit more about that in a second. And we also use Canadian Newsstream to actually go and look at news sources and their mention of CNODES publications, but also CNODES members, and to see how they engage with the public through the news. And with that, we're able to produce some indicators. Some of the classics one that you probably already know, like publication counts and citation counts, but also the altmetrics indicator that I already mentioned, such as social media, news, policy document, etc. This is just to give you an idea of like what is this altmetric.com thing. If you've navigated the internet looking for publications lately, you might have seen this donut. It's becoming somewhat well known, and it's just a number, but it's representing the visibility that a specific publication has among different types of platforms, right? And you have a list here of the types of sources that altmetric.com gathers from. And so what we did with the 92 papers is we went and collected whatever altmetric.com collected and aggregated that in order to produce our indicators. So the first question, who is CNODES? Oops, sorry. Well, with the 92 publications, we were able to produce this network of co-authorship within those 92 publications. So we can provide a map like this one, where we can see the main actors of the network and who collaborates with who. I don't know many of the people in this network. Maybe you recognize yourself in your little collaboration network. You see that there are purple and orange nodes in this network, and that's representing gender. So that's another thing we can do. We can look at the socio-demographic characteristics of the people that compose this network, and we can look at gender more closely. We know that gender equality is extremely important. So having data to support or to actually look at the network of CNODES members or co-authors, and how does it look like in terms of gender parity. We have a portrait here, almost half and half in terms of people, but you can also see that in terms of total authorship, there's a little bit of an overrepresentation of men, and also in terms of first author. That's the kind of information we can provide. Now, if we look at what CNODES has been doing over the last decade, of course, it has published papers. That's the part that I focused on, that we focused on in this analysis. So these are the timeline of the publications, nothing very special. But then we can dig deeper into these publications. And using, like I said, the Web of Science and the Microsoft Academic Graph, we are able to, it's basically what we do a bit of methodological note here. We have the entire Web of Science in this case, so these numbers are based on the Web of Science, and we're able to map the entire database, so I don't know how many million publications there are, and we have these little clusters. So when we count citations for one of the CNODES paper, we actually compare that paper to the other publications that are in the same cluster, so that we can basically produce these normalized indicators that are more meaningful than the simple count, because what you publish about, of course, matters. So we compare each paper to the same kind of paper. And interestingly, what we find is that the CNODE has 41% of its publication in the top 10% most cited in these clusters, which is, I think, extraordinary. I guess 4 times the expected number if the numbers were random. So that's kind of impressive. In impact area, we can say that your papers are cited on average 2.63 times the average paper. 60% of those publications are above average. So clearly that puts a good bibliometric light on CNODES in a research impact realm. Of course, you already know that your publications are published in some of the top journals out there, namely JAMA, PMG, and the New England Journal of Medicine. And what you probably also know is that your research is cited in important policy documents produced by important organizations like the CDC, the NICE, and the CCA. So these numbers are very great, but we can also provide information about the specific publications or the specific person in the network and the type of impact that they have. So this is a few examples here. This is the normalized citation score. When I said you compare the citations to the average of the field. So basically, these are the top cited papers. You see that the first one is cited 20.5 times the average paper in its field. So we can produce this type of tables. We can also look at more closely at the specific policy documents that have cited CNODES. So the number is great, but we've pulled out information on, okay, which document is citing CNODES? Who is the organization that published this document? And what is the actual reason why our paper was cited in that document? And then we are able to populate that table with more information that contextualize, the number. One policy mentioned, that's great, but what does it mean? How relevant is it? We are building a database that contains such evidence. And if you dig even deeper, you can go in the document and extract the part, or the sentence or the section where CNODES is mentioned, so that you can accumulate these little sections of policy documents where you can look and get a quick understanding of what was said, why was our paper or research useful for that specific document, whether it's a policy document or a newspaper or whatever. So these are just examples of these policy documents and the information that we went and looked for and grabbed and deposited in a centralized database, which is what we're doing. and a third example of such a text snippet. So those were the policy documents. We can, like I mentioned, look at which papers are the most tweeted. We can also retweet those tweets. I don't have an example here, but yeah. So those are the papers that were the most visible on social media, or specifically Twitter. You can see that the same article was the most mentioned in the news. Of course, these things correct, but not always. For example, the second one is different. So yeah, you have a lot of news mentions. We can look at what specific papers are being mentioned, and then we can, of course, go and look at the context, which is part of our project. This is an example of what are the actual, right? Beyond the number, you have 12 news mentioned. What does that mean? But we can go and get the articles that have cited this work. And so you can see, are those important newspapers, are there, what kind of sources are mentioning us? Where are they located in the world? Where are we having this kind of impact or this kind of visibility? And that is information that we retrieve again and want to accumulate and centralize so that you can use it to support your narratives. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to go and find all these different places where your publications have impact, whether it's the classic scientific impacts like citations and the impact factor of the journal and all these basic things that the bibliometricians do. But we're trying to go beyond that and look at media policy document, and not only the counts, but the actual contextualized reference to CNODES work within these documents, right? And we're also trying to visualize who CNODES members are, how they work together, what are their sociodemographic characteristics, and all of that is an attempt to build a structure, a database that will provide this empirical support provide empirical support to your impact narratives when you need to renew your funding, when members of CNODES have to apply for their own funding or for promotion within their own organization. What if they had a data source that they could just like look for their research in there and pull examples of mentions in the news of their name and their work and sort of aggregate that or make that part of their story. So that's kind of what we're trying to do on top of the normal publication counts, etc. I will just go to my next slide. So the strength of what we are building is, like I already mentioned, I think the comprehensiveness of the data. So we're not limited to one or the other of types of data that are typically used for the impact stories. The fact that we are using the entire Web of Science or Microsoft Academic Graph allows us to normalize data, so to produce indicators that are more meaningful than singular counts, and that we're trying to centralize it so that it can be all accessed in one place and computed and used in whatever way we want to use it, but easily, without having to reproduce the work all the time of getting all these data points into all these different sources that are sparsely distributed. Of course, as always, it's important when we talk about bibliometrics, I always like to remind myself and everyone that the numbers that we can produce are, they have little meaning, right? Without the impact narrative that I've constantly repeated during my presentation. So I think to some extent, the whole essence of my presentation, or the work that we're trying to do, is to overcome this limitation of the bibliometric indicator by adding more information that can contextualize these numbers and help the people who use these numbers use them better and more effectively to fulfill their needs and get their funding and get their renewals and their promotion, etc. The next steps for next 5 years, since we're thinking about the future, one thing we didn't do yet is highlighting the trainees in the network and what they do and how we can track their career and how CNODES has helped them become better researchers or help their careers. That's something that we want to gather data on. We want to expand our data sources. Right now, we use a Canadian news source for the news, but there's of course global databases, so we want to incorporate those and expand our reach in terms of the data we can collect, streamline our processes, and then of course we have this data that we're accumulating, and we want to make that accessible to you and everybody who would find it useful, and through a dashboard with an interface that you could just navigate the data and see the graphs and look and retrieve whatever it is that you need to retrieve, or download the entire data set if that's what you want. And all of this is stored on a MySQL server right now, which of course I could give you access to. So that's another way in which you could have direct access to this comprehensive data set that we are building about CNODES and its work and its impact. So that's what we're trying to do. And I think I'm out of time anyway. So yeah, right on time. Thank you for having me, and thank you for your support and for giving me this time to talk about the work that we've been doing. So
excellent, yeah. Philippe. Thank you very much. This is amazing stuff. I never see these kind of presentations. I'm just astounded, and I am particularly proud about the fact that all of the studies that you've shown that are that have the highest citations in Twitter and across the board are first authored by many of our trainees. And I think this is crucial, and this was something very special. So, and our trainees are now all over the world in positions that are in faculties and places where they can actually apply this knowledge that they develop. So thank you. And your goal of looking at the future of these trainees is also very important. Thank you very much, Philippe. I now want to introduce Mike Patterson, who's going to talk to us about a very important project that we've been developing for years at CNODES, the Common Data Model. So Mike, everybody knows Mike. He's a scientist at ICES in Toronto. He leads the Chronic Disease and Pharmacotherapy Research Program. He's an assistant professor in family medicine at McMaster and at the Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. He serves as the Ontario site lead for CNODES. And with Robert Platt, he co-leads the CNODES Common Data Model project, as well, of course, as being involved in all of the studies that CNODES has. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Samy. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect.
Can you hear me all right?
We hear you very well.
Wonderful. So thank you very much, Samy. I'm really excited to be able to share our progress on the Common Data Model project. It's been, I think, 2 years since we introduced the idea of the project at one of our semi-annual meetings. So it's great to be able to close the loop and share some of the results so far. First off, I want to say I'm presenting on behalf of a very large team, and I will introduce the members of that team in a minute. So just to recap, the mandate of CNODES is to use our population-based administrative healthcare data to provide timely responses to queries from Canadian public stakeholders, primarily Health Canada and the drug plans regarding the safety and effectiveness of prescription drugs. And the process by which we have done this to date follows the following outline. So essentially what we would normally do in our traditional projects is we would receive a query from one of the query authors, a Health Canada representative or public drug plan representative. We would work with the query author to refine the query and seek approval for that query. We would then go away, develop a project team and a narrative scientific protocol. And once approved by the query submitter, submit that narrative protocol for data access at each of our sites, as well as research ethics approval if appropriate. While that's under review, the team would then essentially translate that narrative protocol into a statistical analysis plan. This is a very detailed document that includes mock tables, SAS code to help improve the efficiency of implementation of the statistical analysis plan. And we would normally test that plan at least a couple of sites to make sure it's producing the results we're expecting. And then once we're happy with those outputs, we would then ask the other sites participating in the project to implement the SAP. Those results would then be lodged centrally at our coordinating center involving members of our methods team, and they would most often meta-analyze the results across the various data centers. Samy showed this forest plot earlier. It's just an example of one of the many meta-analyses that we've undertaken over the years. And this one is from a study that looked at statins and diabetes incidence. And here you can see that the pooled rate ratio across the participating sites, 15% increase in the risk of incident diabetes among individuals newly initiated on high potency statins relative to lower potency statins. So that's just an example of the sort of meta-analytic plot that we would generate in our studies. So the process that I've outlined has a number of important advantages. First off, we can design whatever study we like using this approach. We can employ whatever statistical methods we would like. It's a very flexible approach and it allows us to work closely with the knowledge user, the query submitter, to develop a plan that's going to meet their needs. Importantly, each of our individual data centers has to implement the protocol, the statistical analysis plan, and that helps build capacity at the local level. So as Samy mentioned, an important element of CNODES is the training activities that we undertake. So this helps us develop a cadre of analysts across the country with specific expertise in pharmacoepi and administrative data, and also allows them to learn how to work as a team and to implement these sorts of protocols. And lastly, it allows us to work very closely with the query submitter. They're involved in the development of the protocol. We do this iteratively, so we're ensuring that they're content with the work that we're doing and the outputs that they're going to expect. The approach that we've used to date, however, has some limitations, and one of them is timeliness. At some of the provincial data centers, we've had difficulty getting access to data cuts in a timely manner. And also the process of translating statistical analysis plans into code at the local level. Although we do have templates and SAS macros, and we use standardized approaches to exposure, covariate, and outcome definitions, and our standardized tables are made available to all the sites for population. There still are opportunities for error and inefficiency in this approach, and we obviously have to do a lot of work to ensure through our quality assurance mechanisms that we minimize the risk of those errors and explore the reasons for them when they do occur. So I'm going to talk in a minute about an alternative model. On the left here, we have the approach I've just described, which is a common protocol model where we distribute a statistical analysis plan that then is translated at the local level to populate a set of standardized tables for pooling. And on the right, we have a common data model. And in this model, rather than distribute a statistical analysis plan, what we do is we agree on a set of standardized data tables. So we transform our core administrative data into a set of standardized agreed common data tables. And this allows us to be able to share code, tested code across all of the sites that can then run against those standard tables to generate a set of outputs to respond to the research question. So when we wanted to explore the development of a Canadian version of a common data model, all we had to really do was look south of the border to borrow the experience of the FDA Sentinel initiative. And that is in essence what they have developed over the years, a set of common data tables and a set of reusable, flexible, modular SAS programs that answer a suite of questions that are commonly answered or questions that are commonly asked of the data by FDA. And these range from very simple queries looking at things like the number of individuals newly exposed to drugs over specified time periods, nested within clinical cohorts, to crude outcome event rates following new drug exposure, to patterns of switching and concomitant drug use, to more recently propensity score match, stratified and weighted analyses that allow for better control for confounding. So all of these tools, these reusable query tools, are available in the public domain, as is their Sentinel Common Data Model. So this slide just shows the key data tables in the Common Data Model. In the upper left-hand corner, the tables that are derived from administrative health data. In the lower left corner, the death registry, and in the lower right corner, the mother-infant linkage table. And these are all tables that we've constructed, transformed our local Canadian provincial administrative data into these tables. So in the upper left, just very quickly, I'll just highlight some of the key tables. So the enrollment and demographic table, they're derived primarily from our provincial health insurance registries, the dispensing table from our prescription drug claim data, and the encounter, diagnosis, and procedure tables draw upon a number of different data sources. The physician service claims, the hospital discharge abstracts, our emergency department records, through the National Ambulatory Care Reporting System, same-day surgical records, and all of these are linked using a unique patient identifier, an encryption or a modification of the health insurance number in each province. Again, another slide I've borrowed from the Sentinel team, and this really just illustrates the process that we're following in our pilot projects and will follow in the future as we use the Common Data Model for our queries. So in essence, here, the FDA Sentinel operations team work closely with the query submitters to populate the SAS programs. They have to obviously specify the nature of the patients and drug therapies and outcomes they wish to study. And once those query programs are populated and tested at the local level, they can be distributed to the data partners, 19 odd data partners in their distributed database. Those are then run against the Common Data Model tables at each of the sites. The outputs are reviewed and, if acceptable, returned back to the coordinating center for pooling. And really, this is the model that we've leveraged for our Common Data Model project within CNODES. So the project here had a number of objectives. It was initially to establish a multi-stakeholder advisory group that included representatives of Health Canada, the provincial drug plans, CADIF, and others, Kai to help us work through the details of this project. We wished initially to create a CDM model that would allow at least 3 of our provincial data centers to complete a series of demonstration project in the first 4 pilot sites. We've since rolled this out to 2 additional sites. With the help of the advisory committee, we identified a number of pilot projects. These are projects that had been undertaken by the Sentinel team, and we modified and run in our sites. We therefore carried out those studies and monitored the timelines associated with them. We developed a customized query approval process for the CDM queries, established timelines for timeliness of response, and reported just this past winter to DSEN and Health Canada on the progress, and are sharing our lessons here and in multiple meetings as well. As I mentioned, I'm part of a large team, and here are team members, the project leads and advisors, the site investigators that are participating in our project, and the analysts involved as well. So just to update you on the status of our project, we now have the CDM fully functional in all 6 of our data centers. In addition, our BC data center has access to the US market scan data and has been able to transform that into the common data model for use in queries that are interested in including US data. We've completed 3 pilot projects, and in contrast to the timelines that we would expect in our protocol-based studies, which typically exceed a year, we were able to get those pilot study timelines down to less than 90 days. We have a number of projects underway. The first is an international collaboration that Samy mentioned, and we'll hear a bit more about later. And this is looking at the impact of angiotensin receptor blocker recalls of the last few years, and the effect that they had on patterns of drug use and switching and so on. And this is a collaboration with the FDA Sentinel team and teams in the UK and Denmark. We just recently received approval for 2 new queries. These are COVID-19 related queries. The first, again, a collaboration with FDA and EMA, is going to look at the natural history of coagulopathy in COVID-19 patients. And the second will look at steroid use and outcomes in patients with COVID-19. This is just a sample table that came from one of our pilot studies, just to illustrate the type of project that we undertook during the pilot project. It looks at bleeding among new users of direct oral anticoagulants versus warfarin. And you can see at the right-hand side, these are all crude rates by agent and age. And the crude rates increasing with age, as we would expect, and the rates generally being greater in warfarin compared to the DOACs. And these results are consistent with work that we did at the same time, actually, in a protocol-based analysis that was published recently in CMAJ Open, in which we compared the DOACs with warfarin to look at a range of outcomes in a more sophisticated design that included adjustment for confounding. Well, we're very proud at the progress that we've made with the pilot project. Certainly there's some lessons along the way that we can take away from the experience that we have. I think first off, we were expecting more rapid approval times at the sites. And in fact, in that 90-day average project timeline, up to 60 days of that 90 days were just seeking approval of data custodians and ethics review boards at some of the sites. And so therefore, where while we do have rapid review times at some of the sites, others we hope to be able to negotiate more rapid approval times to bring that response rate down. Second, we've only really initiated the single project, the ARB recall project, under the guise of the CDM, and we do have other projects just approved and under review, but at the moment we haven't really tested the CDM out in the real world, so to speak. The next point relates to access to Quebec data. We've done a lot of work to try to negotiate access to Quebec data to include it in our CDM projects. We've approached INES and had multiple discussions with INES to hope to include Quebec data for a variety of reasons, including organizational priorities. We weren't able to do so to date, but we're hopeful that with time we will be able to include Quebec data. Well, a few other lessons include some of the missing data elements that we need to work on bringing into the CDM, including lab test results beyond the COVID-19 labs and other exposures, let's say, that aren't routinely available in our claims data, like vaccines and hospital-based dispensings. The currency of the CDM tables in the provinces vary from province to province. Some we have more rapid refreshes of our data feeds. Others are refreshed on an annual basis. And so we have to take that into account in our in decisions about which provinces participate in our projects. And last, I guess building on one of my earlier comments, the tests that we've done of the CDM so far are really in a pilot mode, and we haven't really had a lot of experience in the real world. So definitely the timelines that I mentioned will have to grow a little bit to incorporate time for consultations with the query submitters. So just in summary, some of the things we hope to work on moving forward include negotiating more rapid approval times, continuing to explore access to Quebec data, and to expand our experience with the analytic programs that are available and new data sources like the mother-infant linkage table that we have built at some of our sites. So we're looking for demonstration projects and opportunities to use some of those tools in the future. Last, I just want to acknowledge the team members within the CDM project, our funders and members of our project advisory committee, obviously the folks at the FDA Sentinel team, operations center who helped tremendously as we built the CDM in Canada, and obviously also our colleagues at CIHI who helped a lot with the project, and in particular assistance with transformation of our physician service claims into a standardized format. So thanks to all, and happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. Again, this is an extremely important project for CNODES, and I'm happy you were the one to lead it to this point here, and it will become an important tool for Canadian stakeholders to address questions. Clearly, it will become. Thank you very much, Michael. Now we are moving to our session on international collaboration. So we have been in situations where CNODES has been contacted, Health Canada has been contacted by other agencies to collaborate, and I'm very happy to present two of these international collaborators. The first one is from the European Medicines Agency. I'm thrilled to have Xavier Kurt from the EMA to present to us his project, the EMA project, the Darwin project. So Xavier Kurtz joined the EMA 15 years ago. He leads the data analysis workstream He studied medicine in Belgium at the Université de Liège and has a doctorate in epidemiology and biostatistics from McGill University. He was probably among our first cohorts of trainees in pharmacoepidemiology at McGill. He was a member of the Department of Pharmacology at the Université de Liège and the Belgian Center for Pharmacovigilance, so he has tremendous experience, and he has been with EMA for 15 years. He will share with us this very important project. Thank you very much, Xavier, for being with us today.
Thank you, Samy. I hope that everything is going well and that you see my slide. So thank you for inviting me. I'm a bit embarrassed because we are now here at the EMA where you were 10 years ago when you started to develop CNODES and where the FDA started to develop something else. But it's good that I'm going to show it my presentation now, and then Jeff will give his presentation afterwards. So because I will give what we want, the information on what we want to do, and then he will give the presentation that I hope someone from EMA will give in 10 years from now at the 20th anniversary of CNODES. So what I'm going to present is the project that we are really starting now this year. This is the Darwin EU network. And where does it come from? Is that for a number of years now, we support the regulatory decision-making by the scientific committees with real-world evidence that complement the data requested to companies. For example, we provide data on the extent and patterns of drug utilization in the course of signal evaluation. We do some studies on safety issues, and also we frequently, this is one of our main analysis actually, the measurement of the effectiveness of risk minimization measures. So to see whether the decisions that we are taking really changed the clinical practice, whether there has been a reduction of use or indications, and when there is a restriction of the use of some products, what has been the switching patterns to alternative drugs. We are doing that by using licensed electronic health records that we have in-house, and these are from UK, France, and Germany, but we also contract externally to academic centers complex studies. And these studies are performed in a variable number of European databases. So each consortium, each network has its own access to its own database. And in 2018, we did a study looking at the characteristics and potential for use in medicines regulation of the existing database in Europe. So we included in the study the data source, which we thought were available to regulatory authorities or to third parties for research purposes, that contain information on both drug exposure and health outcomes, database which are not disease or product specific, and where there is a longitudinal data capture. And what we did already exhaustive search for this database, and what we found is that we found 35 electronic health care databases in 13 member states that were suitable for regulatory decision making. However, they had all different terminologies and dictionaries, different structures, different validation, and different access arrangements. So there was a very large heterogeneity in the structure and information contained in this database. So it was rather difficult to use them in a consistent manner. We reflected upon it, and then the year after, we published this paper on the challenges and possible solution for use of real-world data for regulatory decision-making. We introduced this concept of optimal framework. And in this paper, we propose a number of solutions that would be applicable, and operational solutions included to landscape the potential data source, to have documentation on data source characteristics and policy for collaboration, to know which data source had the data anonymization processes and what were the data sharing agreements. So the next step was in 2020, where a task force of the heads of medicine agencies, from each member state and with EMA, studied what would be the conditions and what would be the possibilities for better use of big data for regulatory purpose. The report was published last year in January, and it included 11 recommendations. And you see that the first one is to deliver a sustainable platform to access and analyze healthcare data from across the EU. So this is called Darwin EU. And there are then a number of recommendations. I will describe a bit the Darwin EU network and then give just a couple of words on some of the important recommendations. So what is Darwin? So as I explained, the reason is that the current EU access to healthcare data is limited, complex, and slow. So we want to establish a network of data, expertise, and services to better support decision-making via rapid access and analysis and increased reliability, validity, and representativeness of EU health data. So this is ambitious project, and this is probably an important slide because it shows what we want, what we would like to do, but also the complexity of the system in Europe, where you have 27 member states with different structure and different systems. So the concept is that this would be a distributed data network where the data stays local and can be remotely queried with exchange of anonymous data. However, we realize that there is a large heterogeneity in the data source. So we do not think that all databases will be possible to convert them in a common data model. You may know that there is currently a project that is ongoing, the Eden project, funded by the European Commission, that is converting a large number of databases into the OMOP CDM, and it works rather well. So there will be a large number of databases available in the OMOP CDM. However, there will probably many databases that will not be convertible in a CDM. So we think that there will be a need for still a hybrid approach. And then there will be a coordination center. The graph on the right shows a bit the structure. So let me explain it. EMA will keep the oversight of the system and the oversight of the coordination center. The coordination center will need to cope and to integrate the priorities, but also the data that are being held by a large number of different systems. First of all, we have a new system that is being established by the European Commission of data permit authorities. So these are authorities that at the national level may facilitate access to public health data correspond with the in the context of the data protection regulation. There are also a number of data partners who are public or who can be private. And then there are the national computer authorities, which have their own database. So there will be a work to be done to, first of all, establish a network, a consistent, coherent network of database, and then to conduct studies within this network. I am pleased to say that now this is a matter of 2 to 3 weeks where we are going to publish the call for the contract with the coordination center. So this will be done. We hope that this contract will be signed this year. So this is really starting now. So how this could work in practice, at least in the first stage, we anticipate that questions that impact committee will be identified. EMA or National Competent Authority will evaluate the relevance and the feasibility of the real-world data to answer that question. The research questions will be defined. Then this research question will be passed to the coordination center that will create a protocol and programming code to access the database that are converted to the common data model. The data holders will run the codes in their own database, then provide the aggregated data, and the coordinating center will then integrate this data, analyze them, and communicate the result to the EMA or the National Competent Authority. Another recommendation, which is a bit aside of the Darwin network, is the objective to establish a EU framework for data quality and representativeness. So this will develop guidelines and a process for data qualification of database through scientific advice, and also will promote across member states the uptake of electronic medical record, registries, genomic data, and so on. And this is a project that we have launched last month. So this is also a call that has been launched, and that probably will start in a couple of months. Then an important one is also the data discoverability. And the reason is the fact that we have a lack of knowledge of all the data that are available in member states, lack of knowledge on characteristics of the data. And therefore, this project will aim to enable data discoverability via an external study to agree key metadata to describe the data source. And there will be then EU resource database that will be created and that will then signpost all the database that will be able to be identified according to the certain research questions and the characteristics of the database. This is a project that has already started also. So we have started the first phase, and there is a consortium that is working now to define the metadata and to define the criteria to include the data source in the new EU resource database. And we are launching also at the same time now the 4-year study to identify all relevant data sources in Europe and collect metadata and make public this metadata for data discoverability. The fourth recommendation that is, I think, important is to develop the big data training curriculum and strategy based on a skill analysis, and this will be made through the announcement of the EU post-authorization studies register. So this is, you may know that there is a EU PASS register that is existing now in Europe, but we aim to enhance it or to create a new one, but to improve the transparency regarding studies. So these are my conclusions. So we aim to have a Darwin EU network as part of the EU Health data space. Real-world evidence will be an established source of evidence. Data will be discoverable and of known quality and representativeness. The EMA and EU network will have knowledge and experience in data science and data analysis. We will develop learning initiatives. We will have guidelines and standards available and full compliance with data protection and ethics. So this is my last slide. So thank you for your attention. I can answer questions also at the end.
Oh, Xavier, thank you very much. This is going to be a very ambitious project. You are dealing with, but I guess we'll get into the discussion later with the Q&A. But this is quite a project, and I think it will be tremendous for our international collaboration. Thank you so much, Xavier, for this. And I now want to move to the next speaker. The next speaker is Jeff Brown from the FDA Sentinel Project. He's an associate professor in the Department of Population Medicine at Harvard. He has leadership roles in FDA Sentinel, but also PCORNet and other consortia. He trained in economics and social policy, but most importantly, I have to say that Jeff is the 8-time US national champion and 3-time world champion in ultimate frisbee. So I think this is crucial. This means that he has many different skills. He doesn't just play with data, but he can also play very well with a frisbee. Jeff, thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience with us.
Great, thanks, Samy. So I got my video on, and you can see the frisbees behind me, all very meaningful. So thanks so much for having me. I think I'm gonna talk about Sentinel and what we do, but Michael gave such a great presentation about distributed networks and data models that we're pretty set on understanding some of these. I'll go relatively quick. But I think I want to start out with the conclusion. It's really been a great day. And actually thinking through, listening to all these presentations, I was one of the reviewers way back when on the DCEN proposals. That it might have been the first round of DCEN proposals, and to see what CNODES can now do is really, it's fun for me to kind of spend the afternoon listening. So I think I said I'd start with some conclusions. At this point, international collaborations are not a can we do it, but an absolutely we can do it. I don't think of it even as experimental anymore, and particularly between FDA or Sentinel and CNODES. I think we've been working so closely together for the last couple of years. It's ready to go, right? We're just looking, we need the right topics and the right examples and use cases. Particularly because we have the same data model and we have a lot of the same approaches, and we've been working together for a while. So that's not a question really anymore. And I actually want to point out that, or maybe just mention that I think thinking about international collaborations, it's not just doing the same study in multiple places. I think the data sources and the characteristics of the different locations can complement each other. So it's not that you just have more and more data and it's just more sample, but each area, whether it's Canada or working in the EU or in Asia, the data sources will bring unique characteristics that can complement each other. So you can do studies that can complement each other versus just doing a bigger one, which we can also do with the way we've organized the data. So as I go through my slides, I'll try to focus on kind of the things I think that are kind of unique about Sentinel and that I think have helped us be successful. I'll assert that we've been successful, and we'll go from there. So I'll do a quick overview of Sentinel, think about some new things we're doing, and then think about how I think about these resources, their national versus international resources. So just as the primer, Sentinel has the benefit of being a congressional requirement. The Congress said to the FDA, "Thou shalt create the Sentinel initiative to conduct post-market safety surveillance." So it wasn't an option, it was a requirement. And so FDA, given this directive, went and created Sentinel. We launched it as a pilot, which I think was a really important part of our success, is that it wasn't, we didn't kind of jump right in, but we gave ourselves the breathing space to be a pilot. And that started in 2009. We were calling ourselves Mini Sentinel. So we named it Mini on purpose to distinguish it, to make it into that pilot. And we spent a while. Look, you can see we spent almost 7 years in pilot phase before we launched in 2016 to be Sentinel. I'll describe why there's a cut point there and why it's important. It's really a regulatory distinction. Over this time, we should have hundreds, probably thousands, I'm sure it's thousands of queries for FDA and continue to do so, and the network continues to grow and build. This is almost a scary slide. It's a really large set of partners that we have. There's folks that provide data and science, there's folks that are providing scientific input. You know, we work really across the board with people all over the country in the US to make this work. We have subcontracts with all of them, which keeps our folks busy. Actually, subcontracts with nearly all of them. So it's a big, messy network, but with a coordinating center that sits at Harvard. Michael described the idea of a common data model. So Sentinel is built on a common data model that was designed actually very specifically for medical product safety surveillance. And we knew that going in, and which is why we designed it the way we did. This is actually a slightly updated model from the one Michael had, because now we just moved to version 8 of the model. And I'll describe kind of what, I'll mention how the changes we made to go to version 8. But in the beginning, the idea was keep it simple and have success and then grow. So what you're seeing here, as I mentioned, this is Sentinel Common Data Model version 8. Version 1, didn't have inpatient data, didn't have mother-infant linkage data. Certainly these auxiliary tables and the clinical data, they weren't there. There was no prescribing data because most of our partners had dispensing and not prescribing, so don't bother. So we kept it simple, showed success, and built, and we had the time to do that. And our FDA colleagues were fully on board with that being the approach versus build big and spend years building and then hope you built it right. So we built small and grew and adapted. It's really how we went about kind of growing the network. There's a whole set of data quality transformation or data quality reviews we do. It's a distributed database. We have 17 data partners, I think, at this point, and we work with those partners every time they refresh the data to do these data quality checks. Our requirement is that the data have to be of high enough quality, and quality is not the right word, but I'll use it here, to use it immediately. So if FDA calls, we have a data set sitting, waiting, and curated at all of our partner sites, ready to go. That was our requirement. That's not how you have to do it, but that's how we did it, because that was one of the requirements that were laid out. It's a really big data set. I mean, it's a really big distributed network. We now have Medicare data, which is why it kind of grew a lot recently, but it's almost 800 million person years of data and lots of dispensings and medical encounters. You can imagine it's big. We follow that same distributed approach, distributed querying. We send programs for all of our work. We send programs to our partners. They execute those programs behind their firewalls, and they return just results to us. We have a secure system for doing that. We use software that we developed, actually called PopMedNet, that kind of does this, that moves the files back and forth. All of the questions we ask are not public, so they have to be secure. We have a requirement. We have a pretty steep requirement for security from FDA. So the whole network really has to be secure because it's not public information if FDA is asking a question. So that's just another one of our rules that we had to follow. And everything, actually, this is an old version of the website. It's much nicer now, actually. So we have the Sentinel website. The point here is that there's a really very high level of transparency. The requirement is that everything that is done will eventually make its way to this website. So when every report we do, all the tools we build, all eventually ends up here on the website. And I think part of our ability to be successful, I think, was around this transparency. It makes it really clear, and it really focuses the mind if you know that everything you do is going to be public. But in addition to kind of starting small and building, we had really clear governance in the beginning, and it was the easiest part of that governance is FDA was hiring us to do something pretty specific, and it was our job to make it happen. And because it was a pilot, it was a pretty small group. Actually, it was a really small group at FDA that was in charge of it. They essentially said, we hired you guys to figure out how to do it. You do it. We'll give you the time, but this is what you need to be able to do. So they set the rules up and they let us go off and do it and held us accountable. And that was the nature of the first few years of the network. So now some of the fun stuff. This is thinking about Sentinel as a regulatory activity. This is what it says in the legislation, and my translation is that FDA cannot issue a post-marketing requirement or a post-marketing commitment to a pharmaceutical manufacturer if FDA determines that Sentinel can do the study. That's the sufficiency requirement. So FDA can't ask company A to do a study if FDA can do that study in Sentinel. So that's the regular, and you'll see this language actually in drug approval letters in the US now. So this is the translation. Can Sentinel, that's the red box essentially, can Sentinel do it? Yes, then FDA has to do it. No, then you can have a post-marketing commitment. And for all those no's, we want to see whether we can change them into yeses by building new capabilities or new data or improving the data model. For example, the mother-infant linkage table was built because drug use in pregnancy was leading to a lot of no's. So could Sentinel build the mother-infant linkage table that would allow FDA to do some of those studies that it was now asking others to do? Lots of stuff. This is just stuff on the website that we can see. So safety communications, Sentinel's been used in advisory committee meetings, and certainly we publish a fair amount. I'll just build this. One of the things we've been doing recently, as I mentioned, we have version 8 of the data model. So what did we do? We added prescribing. We did that basically for CPRD and I think even CNODES that might have had prescribing data. Our partners really don't have much prescribing data, so it wasn't important, but other partners around the world do have prescribing data, so we added it. We added international codes for procedures and diagnoses and dispensing. We built it as a US-based network, so we wouldn't have we don't have the flags for the kinds of drug codes that are available in Canada or around the world. So we just added them to the model. That's not a big change to the model, but it makes it clear how things work. We actually changed zip code to postal code. I think Michael probably asked for that. I don't know how we ended up doing that, but I think that was just to make it a little easier for the rest of the world to think about. The zip codes are something that's only in the US, I think. For COVID-19, we've built a rapidly refreshed data set. So I think this is just to think how you can respond to an emergency, essentially, or responding to a pandemic. So if some of our partners are refreshing their data sets every 4 to 6 weeks versus really every 3 to 6 months or more, to be able to give FDA a little bit fresher look at the data. There's a couple studies we've been doing for COVID that they'll be out there in the public. And we did add an innovation center to Sentinel that it now has its own personality or its own branding that focuses on what Sentinel will look like in 2 years and 5 years and 10 years. So they're really supposed to be looking at the future versus the operations center, which is where I sit, which is focusing on the day-to-day operations. We used to do both, focusing on day-to-day operations and what Sentinel will look like. Now we have really split those two activities. They're linked together. We still really oversee both, but we think of them differently. And the Innovation Center really is thinking about new things to be building versus operating the network. The last point here is, this is a slide I've stolen from a couple folks have thought of it this way. So if we're thinking about data resources, and here there's a common data model. You can think of this as the Sentinel data model or the CNODES data model, or what will be built in Europe as Darwin. There's a central core resource that can be used by multiple organizations. So if this is Sentinel, we can use this resource that we've built. FDA uses it, but it's also used, so these are things that are really happening. It's also used pretty robustly by the pharmaceutical industry, does lots of studies with this Sentinel resource that we sometimes lead, not always. And there's some networks. The NIH is actually using that same exact Sentinel resource to do some of its own work. Pocori has doing the same thing. It's using some of that Sentinel data source for its own work. We've done some pragmatic trials and some randomized trials. CDC is now partnering to do public health surveillance for its own activities, using that same database and those same tools. And international collaborations can use that same platform to support its other activities. And actually, Michael mentioned these. So the ARB study, we've been working a lot with CNODES over the years. So I won't go into these. I guess I'll just mention that we are doing a path study that's using, and I think this is an example of an international collaboration. We at Harvard are leading a study that's being implemented for an EMA path commitment. So it's using US data to support a commitment from Europe. And it's multiple databases that are doing it. So I think that's actually pretty interesting. And Michael mentioned the COVID collaborations. I never know what's public or not, so I can only say, I only wrote COVID collaborations. So, but he mentioned there's one on coagulopathy, and I think another one on steroids. But he named them and I didn't. So let's just be clear about that. All right, thanks, Samy. I'm happy to go through the discussion.
Jeff, thank you very much. I mean, you guys at Sentinel, opened up this world for us at CNODES and clearly in Europe as well. I really want to thank you for sharing this with us and sharing a lot of the methodologies with the Common Data Model team and other teams as well. So now I would like to introduce Ingrid Sketris, who leads our knowledge translation team within CNODES, who will moderate the question and answer. I mean, we're running like 5 or 10 minutes late, but I think we can stay a little longer. And so I would like to invite Ingrid to take this on right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid.
Yes, you can add any questions in the question and answer. And I wanted to thank all the speakers for their stimulating presentations. I know that there's things that we'll all be able to take home to our own workplaces from the presentations. I can start with a question. Barry talked about integrated knowledge translation, and we have some experience with that in CNODES, but I know we need to gain more. So I would like to ask Jeff and Xavier, They work with lots of partners, regulatory agencies, academic partners, payers, and others. And can you give us some idea of your tips for successful collaborations with knowledge users?
So I guess I can try, you know, and for Sentinel, everything is really for the FDA. It actually, it focuses the mind, right? We're working for them, and then it's really up to them to figure out how to use the information. If you're thinking about dissemination, I guess, and it's possible I misunderstood, but I'm thinking about dissemination, and we're mostly focused on them, and that's kind of the end of it. You know, we publish and do things like that, and we actually have public meetings and try to build or bring in. We actually try to bring in the public to those meetings. And just starting to do more general outreach, but not necessarily on the results. But I might have misunderstood your question.
No, that's great. Thank you.
But just I can then complement is that from our perspective is a bit different because our knowledge users are primarily regulators. And as you know, we are organizing and we are coordinating the scientific committees. So we have a number of scientific committees that meet at the EMA. Well, now it is more virtually, but we have direct contact with them, and we can disseminate our the evidence collected through studies directly to them. And also one aspect is that our studies and our real-world evidence data collection is based on questions from committees, on issues from committees. So they are directly fed back into the work of the committees.
Great, thanks. And I have a question for Philippe. One of the things we want to do is study capacity development. But it will take a number of years from the time a PhD student starts, and then they go through their postdoc and they move organizations. Can you comment a bit about the challenges of following trainees and the author field in bibliometrics?
Yes, thanks for the question, Ingrid. I think the big challenge is always to just find the person and, you know, track down. It seems simple, right? There's somebody that we trained in 2012, and then he went on to like, okay, and then how do you keep track of all these people? And you're a closely knit network, you probably know the people, so that helps. But from a data collection perspective, you know, we need to be able to find that person, make sure it's the right person, and then be able to track their publications, and then trace back, you know, their trajectory through like their scientific careers and what they've published over time. And there's two challenges. First is collecting all this data and making sense of it, but also linking this to CNODES and the work that they did with CNODE, because people will go and have very diversified career, and it's always a bit challenging to attribute something to a specific sort of network, a specific group, when this is a loose network and people go on into the world and do their own thing and start their own networks. And so there's this, as a CNODES narrative, that's the kind of challenge that we bump into. So how do we relate all of that to CNODE? But that's a storytelling challenge, and but also a data challenge. But I think it's a little bit of both.
Right.
Yeah, so that's what I would say.
Thank you.
I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. And Mike, can you tell me what you've learned for CNODES from being involved both with Sentinel and with the EMA?
Thanks, Ingrid. I would say that still early days in our collaboration with the EMA, but I've certainly learned a whole lot from working with Jeff and the Sentinel team. They've been tremendously helpful in the early days in just translating our data into the common data model, working through the details of the quality assurance programs, and now more recently sharing your aggregation programs as we get to the final days of our ARB project. So I learned so much, mostly from a technical standpoint, and very grateful for all the help that we've received from the Sentinel team.
Ingrid, I have a question for Jeff. We've been asked this question when we present the common data model. Mike knows this very well. Clearly, there is an enthusiasm about this, and the question that comes is, how do we prioritize if we are receiving several queries at the same time? How could we prioritize this? And we're wondering if you have some experience in this prioritization. I mean, there is a limit to the capacity that Sentinel works with. You have to unmute. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to unmute. So there's two parts to that, really. There's the how do we prioritize questions that are coming from FDA. And now, in the old days, it wasn't that hard because there are only two people asking the questions and you just said, which one do you pick the most important one? Now it's really coming from across the agency, and we have a pretty sophisticated system for tracking every request that comes in, identifying teams that are available to respond to those requests, and to let folks know early that this request is in queue, and it'll be picked up when the next team is available. It's really how we're thinking about it. If there's 5 teams and they're all busy, when one of those teams is finished with a query, they'll pick up the next one. Is really how we have to think about it. It's taken a long time for us to get to that way of thinking. But we often will go back to FDA, particularly in the last year or so with COVID, and say, I see that this is urgent. What would you like us to stop? Is really, you have to work with them and do that. There's only so much you can do. That's actually within FDA. I'm doing a lot of work with pharma that's using the same resources, and sometimes the same analysts, and then we have to try to manage that as well. And the last piece of that is managing data partner, the folks at the other end who are going to be asked to respond to these requests. You can't give them 10 things on the same day and ask them all to be done 5 days later. So you really do have to kind of coordinate some of that as well. Transparency is most important with those partners. They should know what's coming up, and we do a lot of work with that as well, just letting them know what we're going to expect from them. But you have to be able to work with the partners on that, on the planning side. It's happening a lot now,
Great.
Which is good, right?
Thanks. I think we have a question in the chat, and I think Lisa Licks that you're unmuted.
Oh, yeah. So thanks. Jeffrey answered the one question that I had about the Innovation Center, but I have another one for Xavier about how some of the work around metadata and data quality can be fed back to the data providers, and how it might help in the future to build the relationships with data providers. Could you speak to that back and forth, so it's not just about kind of moving forward and using the data, but how it might benefit the data providers?
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful question. Our partners have eventually all thanked us, but it wasn't always that way at the beginning, because we're essentially being seen as critiquing their data, or telling them it's not good enough, or they have to fix it and do something. But this intense use of their data, and this third party, us, running what we would call our data checks against it, has improved their data. It's improved their understanding of their data. And I think that is just widely accepted now. And, you know, we're working with a new partner now that is going through this hard lesson with us, where we're saying, are you sure you have that many people over there? And that's a lot of diabetic patients. And we go back and forth. And sometimes it's us being wrong in our data checks. Every time I have to fix that. And sometimes it's issues with their data that we identify. As long as you're being transparent and not, it's not accusatory. And you heard me say, I don't like using the word data quality. That's because of this project. We are not checking the quality of your data. We are characterizing your data. And it is what it is. You know, they didn't make it. So you characterize their data and you talk about it. But we do this over and over with our partners. And in the end, they've all said that their data has become better. They understand it better because we're using it a lot. You know, we're using it a few times a week across the spectrum of clinical areas. So we engage them very early in the process. The first thing we did is spend a year basically talking with our partners that had the data to work on the data model and how we would check in and what we would do. And we were pretty flexible early on with approvals. And then we got a little stricter over time.
Thank you.
What about in Europe, Xavier? Xavier, what about in Europe? Because you're starting this.
Well, yes, we are in the process of really establishing this system. And we think that there are perhaps two ways of feeding back metadata to data providers. First of all, there is a baseline description of the characteristics of the data, but probably the main means to do it would be through studies. And looking when doing a study and then seeing that for one database, it is not possible to extract the data in a certain format, or that it is not possible to get the data that are needed while it is possible to get them from other databases. So I think that we are looking at with the system to use the range of studies that are being done in the database to then feedback and then to extract and update the metadata that would be available for a given database, and therefore to give the data provider information on what is the value of the data.
That's great. And I think, Xavier, you just answered Wussy Man's question as well. That was the last question in our Q&A. So I'm going to now turn it back to Dr. Suissa for closing remarks.
Yeah, well, I just want to thank everyone for presenting this. I want to thank everyone who participated in our virtual meeting. This is a picture from one of our very first in-person meetings. And I'm hoping that very soon we'll be able to connect again physically. We'll be able to meet and discuss and exchange at these meetings in a more human way than this virtual approach. Although this virtual approach was great because it got us the opportunity to have Xavier from Amsterdam and Jeff from Boston to be here with us, and to have Canadians throughout the country to share with us in this talk. I saw that there were a few Americans as well that joined this, and I'm very happy about this. So I'm hoping that we will take this on, and the next 5 years will be as and more productive than we have done in the first 10 years, and that we will work much more closely with our international partners that we are now part of the CNODES family, and I welcome them to the CNODES family. So thank you all for participating about this. Thank you for the organizers for arranging this, the speakers and the participants. Have a great one.